at 9:47 in the morning, in front of every doctor, every surgeon, and every nurse on the floor. Nurse Laura Voss was told she was too stupid to work in medicine. Tray she'd been carrying hit the floor. Instruments scattered across the tile in every direction. The entire surgical team stopped what they were doing and stared. And then slowly, deliberately, Dr. Nathan Greer began to clap. One slow clap, then another, then a third. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, loud enough for the whole corridor to hear, "I present to you the most useless nurse in the history of Harwick General Hospital." Laura got down on her knees and picked everything up, piece by piece, while 30 people watched and said absolutely nothing. Nobody in that hospital knew who she really was. Nobody knew what she had survived. Nobody knew what she was capable of. That was their first mistake, and their worst one. Before this story goes any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories on this channel do not stop at one twist. They go places you won't see coming. Drop a like if you're already feeling something, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The morning shift at Harwick General Hospital in the city of Crestholm started the same way it always did, with noise, with controlled chaos, and with the particular brand of low-grade tension that lives permanently inside emergency departments, inside old walls. Up's noticing it after a while. Or you think you do. Really, it just moves into your body and stays there, and you carry it home at the end of every shift without realizing it until you're standing in your own kitchen at 9 at night, wondering why your shoulders are up near your ears. Gurneys moved fast down the main corridor. Monitors beeped in layered rhythms that experienced staff could read like music. Nurses relayed handoff notes in shorthand that took years to learn, and a different kind of years to unlearn when you left the profession. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed at a frequency that nobody consciously registered, but that everyone absorbed hour after hour, shift after shift, until it became the background noise of an entire working life. Laura Voss arrived at 6:55, 5 minutes before her shift was scheduled to begin. She always arrived early. Not because the job inspired that kind of enthusiasm in her, it didn't, not anymore, not in the way it once had, but because she liked those 5 minutes before the full machinery of the morning got spinning. The brief window when the hallway was almost quiet, when she could walk to her locker, change, orient herself, and take stock without immediately having someone need something from her. She was 32 years old, medium height, lean through the shoulders and arms, in the way of someone who stayed physically capable without making a display of it. Dark brown eyes that moved around a room quickly without appearing to. She wore her dark hair pinned up tight under her cap from the moment she arrived until the moment she left. She didn't wear jewelry on shift. She didn't talk much during breaks. In the 2 years she had worked in the Harwick General Emergency Department, she had eaten lunch alone more times than she'd ever bothered to count. That wasn't an accident or an unfortunate social outcome. It was a choice, made quietly and maintained consistently. The locker room was half empty when she got there. 2 junior nurses she recognized by face, but not by name, gave her the standard polite nod that means, like not the kind, that means absolutely nothing past basic acknowledgement that you exist in the same physical space, and went back to their conversation. Laura changed into her scrubs, tucked her personal phone into her bag, laced her shoes, and stood for a moment at her open locker. At the bottom of it, beneath her spare cap and a folded jacket, sat a small black coin. She didn't pick it up. She looked at it for 3 seconds, no more than that, never more than that, and then closed the locker door. By 7:15, the ER was already running behind. A multi-vehicle accident on the freeway interchange had sent 4 patients in overnight. 2 of them were still unstable. The charge nurse Sandra Briggs, a compact, sharp-edged woman in her late 40s, who had been running emergency floors for long enough that she had stopped explaining her decisions to people who questioned them, was already moving at the pace that made newer staff anxious to watch. Voss. Briggs didn't look up from the board. Trauma 2. Monitor fluids and watch the chest tube output. Doctor. Greer's team is primary. Don't get in their way. That last part wasn't directed specifically at Laura. It was the kind of instruction Briggs gave everyone assigned to a room where Greer was working, because Greer had made it quietly but comprehensively known over 6 years at Harwick General that he considered nursing staff in his trauma rooms to be a necessary inconvenience, like background music you can't turn off. Laura nodded and moved. The corridor from the charge station to Trauma 2 was maybe 40 feet. Covered it in a way she'd developed without consciously developing it, economical, no wasted movement, aware of everything peripheral without looking at any of it directly. She had spent years in environments where the way you moved through a space communicated more about you than anything you said. Old habits didn't leave. They just went quiet. Trauma 2 was exactly what she expected. Organized chaos, with a thin veneer of clinical control stretched over the top of it. The patient, a man in his mid-50s, construction clothing, significant blunt force trauma to the thorax from the impact, was intubated, sedated, lying very still in the way of people whose stillness is entirely pharmacological. His numbers were holding barely. 3 nurses were managing different parts of the rooms simultaneously. 2 residents hovered near the main monitor with the particular posture of people who know enough to be worried, but not enough to know what to be worried, but not to know what to do about it. An anesthesiologist stood at the head of the bed, making small adjustments with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to tune out everything that didn't directly concern the airway. And at the center of it all, moving with the particular confidence of a man who had long ago decided that uncertainty was someone else's problem, was Dr. Nathan Greer. He was 44, tall, broad across the chest, with thick dark hair going silver at the temples in a way that photographed well and that he was not unaware of. He'd been chief trauma surgeon at Harwick General for 6 years, and in that time had built exactly the kind of reputation that protects a person from accountability. Brilliant enough that administrator overlooked things, intimidating enough that staff didn't report them, charming enough in public settings that the overall impression remained favorable to people who only saw him from a distance. He glanced up when Laura entered the room. His gaze moved over her the way it moved over furniture presence, assigning category, moving on. He looked back down at the chart in his hands. She took her position at the bedside and ran through her own assessment, quickly and without announcing it. Chest tube drainage output color and rate both within expected range. Drip rates consistent with what was documented. Monitor readouts, pressure tracking, low normal, oxygen saturation holding at 94. Heart rhythm sinus with occasional PVC clustering that the team was already aware of. She was about to step back when she noticed the pupils. Subtle. The kind of subtle that requires a certain type of attention to catch not the broad sweeping attention of someone scanning for the obvious, but the narrower, almost involuntary attention of someone who had learned in conditions that did not permit inattention that small wrong things tend to precede large catastrophic ones. The patient's left pupil was marginally wider than his right. A millimeter, maybe slightly more. Easy to attribute to the sedation, to the lighting in the room, to the natural asymmetry that existed in a percentage of the population. Except she'd walked past his bed when she entered the room, and she was almost certain it hadn't looked like that 30 seconds ago. She watched it for another moment. Dr. Greer. He didn't respond. Dr. Greer. Slightly firmer. Not louder, just more deliberate. He turned with the slow patience of someone doing a favor. What? His pupils are asymmetric. Left is reading wider than right. I'd estimate a millimeter differential, possibly more. He looked at her for a moment. I'm aware of the pupil presentation. It looks like it's changed in the last minute or two, consistent with his sedation level and the lighting variance in this room. He turned back to the chart. Thank you. She looked at the monitor. His pressure dropped 2 points while I was standing here. That's an expected consequence of the fluid adjustment the team made 20 minutes ago. Been documented. He said it without looking up, in the tone of someone reading from a script they've used before. Laura stepped back. She knew enough about the dynamics of this particular room, with this particular doctor, to understand that pushing a second time in the same breath would produce a response that was worse than the dismissal she'd just received, louder, more performative, and directed as much at the room as at her. She'd seen him do it before. She'd watched other nurses absorb it and say nothing, because the calculation of what it cost to keep pushing versus what it cost to let it go almost always landed in the same place. She stepped back. She kept watching. The patient's left pupil widened again 40 seconds later, measurably, definitively. Not a lighting artifact, not sedation variance, not a millimeter of natural asymmetry, she said. His intracranial pressure is climbing. The room paused. Not dramatically, just that small hitch in ambient activity that happens when someone says something that lands differently than expected. Greer set the charts down on the tray beside him and turned to face her fully. He walked toward her with the measured slowness of someone who has decided to be patient about something they find genuinely irritating. Are you making a neurological diagnosis, Nurse Voss? I'm reporting an observation. Your observation contradicts the clinical picture my team has been managing for the last 4 hours. I understand that. Do you? He stopped about 4 feet from her, close enough to be deliberate. You have what, a BSN and 2 years of emergency floor experience. 3 years. He paused. Excuse me? 3 years. Not 2. Something moved behind his eyes. Not recalibration. Not anything resembling respect. It was closer to the expression of someone who has been corrected on a minor point and found it disproportionately irritating. Step back from the bedside, Voss. You're interfering with the team's workflow. She stepped back, kept watching. For the next 4 minutes, the room continued at its controlled pace. The residents conferred quietly. The anesthesiologist made a note. One of the other nurses rotated a drip bag. Greer returned to the chart. Laura watched the left pupil. At the 4-minute mark, the monitor alarm fired. Not the slow escalating kind that precedes a gradual deterioration. The sharp, declarative kind that means something has already gone wrong. The patient's systolic pressure dropped 12 points in under 30 seconds. His oxygen saturation followed it down. One of the residents said something sharp and clinical. The anesthesiologist moved immediately to the head of the bed. The room went from measured to urgent in the space of a single breath, every person recalibrating their speed and focus simultaneously, the quiet professional hum fracturing into something louder and less organized. Laura was already moving toward the medication tray. She had been watching the prepared syringe since she first took her position at the bedside. It had been sitting there on the tray, drawn up and labeled, for most of the time she'd been in the room. The label read mannitol, the right medication for suspected intracranial pressure elevation. The appropriate intervention, given what she'd been flagging. But something about it had been sitting in the back of her attention since she first looked at it. Consistency in the barrel was slightly off. The color, when the overhead light caught it at the right angle, was a shade thinner than it should have been. Not dramatically. Just enough. She reached for it. Do not give him that. Her voice came out flat and clear and completely without hesitation. Not loud, not panicked. The specific register of someone stating a fact they are certain about. Greer spun toward her. Back away from the medication tray. Right now. Something is wrong with that syringe. That medication was prepared by my resident. I know when it was prepared. The concentration is wrong. Look at the color. He looked at her. 2 full seconds of looking at her with an expression that managed to hold complete dismissal and something sharper, something almost assessing in the same moment. Then he reached for the syringe himself. Don't. The word came out before she decided to say it. The room had gone preternaturally, still, despite the monitor, still screaming its alarm. Every person in trauma 2 was looking at her. The residents, the anesthesiologist, the other nurses, all of them. Greer looked at the syringe in his hand. He held it up briefly, tilted it toward the light, He looked at Laura. Then he administered the medication. Patient coded 4 minutes and 17 seconds later. What followed occupied a particular place in Laura's memory for a long time afterward, not because of the chaos of it, which she had seen before in different forms and in conditions that made a hospital trauma room look structured by comparisons but because of the specific texture of the panic in that room. It had 2 layers. The surface layer was clinical, people moving fast, voices sharp and technical, equipment being repositioned, the resuscitation protocol executing with varying degrees of competence depending on who was running which part of it. That layer she understood completely. The second layer was what she watched Greer do while his team worked. He was managing 2 things at once. His hands were occupied with the resuscitation, but his eyes were moving across the room, to the supply area near the door, to the other nurses, and repeatedly back to Laura. He wasn't just trying to save the patient. He was already doing something else, something organizational, something that had to do with how this room was going to be described afterward. She recognized it the way you recognize weather changing. The patient was stabilized after 23 minutes. He lived. The margin was thin enough that several people in the room spent those 23 minutes genuinely uncertain about how it was going to resolve. When the immediate crisis was over and the room was returning to a lower register of controlled tension, Laura watched Greer step away from the bed and move toward the supply room doorway, spoke quietly with 2 people. One was a resident she didn't know well. The other was Dr. Albert Sims, the hospital's chief pharmacist, a thin, careful man in his early 50s who was rarely in the clinical areas and had no obvious reason to be in or near Trauma 2 at this hour. Conversation lasted maybe 90 seconds. Greer glanced in her direction once during it. Both men looked away when they saw her watching. She went back to monitoring the patient. She didn't say anything. She didn't react. She cataloged what she'd seen the way she had learned to catalog things, without attachment to the implications, without immediate action, filed cleanly for later. The shift ended at 3:30. At 3:45, Sandra Briggs found her at the medication station and said, "I need to talk to you." Conversation was short, and it was not good. Briggs laid it out with the directness of someone who respected her enough not to soften it. A report had been filed. The report alleged that the syringe in Trauma 2 had been tampered with. Electronic records in the system added that afternoon, with that afternoon's timestamp, showed Laura's badge had been used to access the medication room at 7:08 that morning. The hospital's administrative team had been notified. An investigation was being opened. "I was in the medication room at 7:08, Laura said. "I know. Getting your own supplies. Yes." The log also shows an anomaly in the medication cabinet keypad around that time. An override of the default setting. Someone overrode it. "Yes. Not me, Laura." Briggs said her name with the weight of someone who believes you but is already looking at the math. "I know that. But I can't prove it from what's in the system right now. And administration is not going to wait for a full investigation before they act. How long do I have?" "You're suspended, effective right now. Your badge is flagged. Security will escort you out." Laura was quiet for a moment. She looked at the medication station, at the neat rows of labeled drawers, at the laminated protocol sheet on the wall that she'd read enough times she could have reproduced it from memory. She thought about the 7:08 timestamp. She thought about how quickly it had appeared in the system. She thought about Sims, standing in the doorway of the supply room while Greer talked to him. "Okay," she said. "Laura, it's okay, Sandra." She meant it, not in a defeated way, in the way of someone who is already several steps ahead of the immediate situation and has decided that the immediate situation is not the thing that requires her energy right now. She went to her locker. She changed out of her scrubs, packed her bag. She opened the locker one last time and looked at the black coin at the bottom of it, then picked it up and put it in the pocket of her jacket. 2 security guards were waiting for her when she turned around. She walked out through the main emergency entrance because it was the closest exit, past the ambulance bay, past the intake desk, past the automatic doors that opened and then closed behind her. with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The afternoon air outside was cooling. The sky over Crestholm's downtown going that particular shade of gray gold that precedes a cloudy evening. Stood on the pavement outside the entrance for a moment. The ambulance bay was quiet. Someone was loading equipment into a rig about 30 feet away and didn't look up. She walked to her car. She sat in it. She didn't cry. She was not at that moment particularly close to crying. What she felt was something more structural than emotional, the particular sensation of something solid shifting under you, the ground changing its nature without warning. She'd felt it before. Different circumstances, the same essential quality. She thought about the patient, his face before the code, the grayish tinge around his mouth that she'd clocked when she first walked in, the syringe. Greer's hand on it. The 4 minutes and 17 seconds between the administration and the crash. She started the car. The drive home took 10 minutes. Her apartment was on Benton Street, 3rd floor, a unit she'd chosen because it had good sight lines from the main windows and because the building's layout meant there was more than one way out if you needed it. She was not conscious of thinking about exit routes when she evaluated rental apartments. It was simply part of how she assessed spaces. It always had been. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She accessed the Harwick General Employee Portal while her credentials still worked. Pulled up what she could of the patient's file. Name in the system, Daniel Marsh. Age 56. Occupation, contractor. Admitted from the interstate interchange incident. Currently in the ICU, condition listed as critical but stable. She looked at the name for a while. She looked at the medication record. She could see the timestamps. She could see her own badge number in the access log from 708. She could see the notation added at 2:47. That afternoon, which was 47 minutes after she'd been in Sandra Briggs's office, and 6 minutes before Briggs had come to find her at the medication station, closed the laptop. At 9:17 that evening, her login credentials were deactivated. She tried to access the portal out of habit and received the generic error screen. The speed of it told her something. Not a bureaucratic delay, not an end-of-business administrative action. Someone had flagged it for immediate processing. She ate something, did not taste it. She went to bed at midnight. She lay in the dark and thought about the medication cabinet override, about the timestamp, about how precisely and quickly the records had been arranged, about the specific sequence of it, the override, log placing her in the right location at the right time, the notation added, while she was still in the building, the credential deactivation happening within hours rather than days, was not improvised. This had structure. Whoever had built the record against her had done it before the shift even ended, which meant they had been prepared to build it before the shift began. She was still thinking about that when she heard the vehicles outside. She was at the window before she'd finished deciding to move. 4 black SUVs on Benton Street below, staggered at intervals. Engines off, no markings, no light bars. Dark, still. She could make out the silhouettes of occupants in 2 of the vehicles. She stepped back from the window. At 2:14 in the morning, someone knocked on her door. 3 measured beats, even spacing. The knock of someone accustomed to being answered promptly. She moved to the door without turning on any lights. She looked through the peephole. The man in the hallway was in his early 40s. Civilian clothing, dark jacket with nothing on it. He wasn't looking at the peephole. He was looking at the wall to his left, with the particular calm of someone who has spent enough time in confined spaces waiting for doors to open that the waiting itself no longer costs them anything. She opened the door. He looked at her without any visible surprise. Voss, her last name, 1 word. The way names get used in exactly one professional context, and only that one. Who are you with? She said. Not a question. A request for specific information. Joint Task Force, SOCOM attachment. Commander Derek Fallon. She had never met Derek Fallon, but she knew what SOCOM attachment meant at 2 in the morning outside a civilian apartment. Patient, she said. Yes. Daniel Marsh isn't a contractor. No. Federal witness. 14 months in protection. Testimony scheduled in 9 days. He watched her face. The medication was a targeted substitution. Third attempt in 6 weeks. The first 2 were stopped before they reached the clinical setting. Laura leaned against the doorframe. She looked past him at the empty hallway, stairwell door at the far end, the exit sign. They needed me gone first, she said, before anyone started asking questions about the medication. Yes, because I noticed, because you were the only person in that room who was looking at the right things. He paused. That's not an accident. We've been watching the department for 3 weeks. We know your background, Chief Voss. She had not heard that word in a long time, not from anyone who used it correctly. She straightened up. How many inside the hospital? She said. Minimum 3 confirmed. Possibly a 4th we haven't placed yet. Sims. Confirmed. Greer is confirmed. The 3rd is still being established. I need 20 minutes. 15 would be better. She let him in and went to change. She moved through the dark apartment without turning on lights, not because she needed to, but because it was faster, and she was already thinking about the hospital layout, the medication room access points, the ICU floor plan, the security camera positions she'd mentally cataloged over 2 years without ever consciously deciding to. Came back out in 2 minutes, not 15. Fallon was standing in the center of her living room, not touching anything, looking at the single bookshelf across the room with steady, cataloging attention. My team, she said, picking up her jacket. Are they read in? The operational details. Yes. She put the jacket on. She felt the coin in the pocket. She left it there. Then let's go. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. Outside the window, the city of Crestholm was quiet and dark. Somewhere across it, on the 4th floor of Harwick General, a man named Daniel Marsh was breathing through a ventilator, alive by a margin that someone had worked very carefully to eliminate. And the people who had built the case against her, who had placed her badge number in the access log, who had flagged her credentials, who had watched her carry a small cardboard box out through the emergency entrance, those people did not know yet that the woman they had just fired was the most dangerous thing they had ever dismissed. They were about to find out. The elevator in her building was out of service. Had been for 3 days. Laura took the stairs without breaking pace, Fallon 1 step behind her, his footfalls barely audible on the concrete, despite his size. That detail registered somewhere in the back of her attention, and filed itself away the same way everything filed itself, not as a conscious observation, but as accumulated data about the kind of person she was now operating alongside. The night outside hit, cold and damp. Crestholm in late October had a particular quality to its darkness, heavier than summer, dark, more deliberate, the kind of night that pressed in from the sides rather than just falling from above. 2 of the 4 SUVs had their engines running now, exhaust curling pale in the streetlight. A 3rd operator was standing near the building entrance, civilian clothes, hands loose at his sides, not looking at them directly as they came out. Fallon opened the rear door of the 2nd vehicle. Laura got in. There were 2 other people already in the SUV. A woman in her late 30s with close-cropped hair and the kind of face that didn't give much away sat in the front passenger seat with a tablet open on her knee. In the back beside the space Laura now occupied was a younger man, mid-20s, headphones around his neck, a laptop open and running 3 windows simultaneously. Neither of them introduced themselves immediately. The woman in front said, without turning around, "She's smaller than the file photo." "File photo is 6 years old," Laura said. The woman turned then. She had sharp, dark eyes and a faint scar along her left jaw that had the particular texture of something that had been treated quickly and imperfectly. She looked at Laura the way people who are good at reading people look at someone not analyzing, just taking an accurate measurement. "Reyes," she said. "Intelligence liaison. Voss. I know who you are." She turned back to the tablet. "We all do." The younger man said, without looking up from his laptop, "Harwick General's internal network has been partially compromised. Someone with administrator access has been selectively deleting security footage going back at least 11 days. The camera covering the medication room on the trauma floor is the most recent deletion. The file was wiped at 4:22 this afternoon. 4:22, Laura said. That's 38 minutes after I left the building. Yes. Fallon climbed into the driver's seat. The convoy moved. Laura looked out the windows at the passing city. Crestholm at 2:30 in the morning had the stripped-down quality of a set after the production, has wrapped the bones of the place visible without the daytime population filling it in. Storefronts dark, intersections empty. The occasional lit window in an apartment block above, someone awake for reasons unknown. She found she was doing the thing she always did when she was being driven somewhere by people she didn't fully know yet, tracking the route without appearing to, noting turns, measuring time, building a map she could use if the situation changed in a direction that required her to move independently. Old habits. Tell me about the third person, she said. Fallon said. We're still working on confirmation. You said minimum 3 confirmed. Greer, Sims, and a third you haven't placed. That's accurate. What do you have? Reyes answered without looking up from the tablet. Encrypted communications pulled from a server associated with the network we're investigating. The hospital has 3 active participants in the channel. Greer and Sims we've matched to identifiers. The third uses a rotating alias. Content of their communications over the last 6 weeks indicates they have direct access to the ICU schedule, patient assignment rotations, and the medication dispensing log. That's not a pharmacist-level access point, Laura said. ICU scheduling is nursing administration or attending physician level. Yes, which means it's someone I've probably worked with. Nobody in the vehicle said anything for a moment. It's possible, Reyes said. Laura looked back out the window. They were heading east, which would bring them around to the hospital's service entrance rather than the main approach. She understood why, without being told less visibility. Fewer cameras on the approach route and the service entrance gave access to the basement level, which connected to the pharmacy storage, the records office, and the stair stills serving the ICU floor without passing through the main emergency department, where the overnight staff would be concentrated. What's my status when we get inside, she said. Fallon said, officially, you're still suspended. So if the overnight charge nurse sees me, we'll manage the notification chain. You'll have a federal escort visible from the moment you're inside. Nobody is going to challenge the access. Dr. Greer is on call tonight. He went home at 6. He's scheduled to return at 7 for the morning, attending rounds. Sims left the building at 8:15. We have coverage on both of them. So the hospital right now is running a night crew that, as far as we currently know, does not include anyone connected to the network. But we're operating on the assumption that the fourth participant, if there is one, may be on overnight rotation. Laura thought about the overnight staff she knew. She ran through them, methodically charge nurses, floor nurses, the rotating residents attending on call. She was looking for the profile, someone with the right access level, the right institutional knowledge, the right combination of visibility and anonymity that allowed you to move through a hospital without attracting attention. It was a surprisingly large pool of people when you laid it out that way. Who's the overnight attending in the ICU? She said. Reyes checked her tablet. Dr. Patricia Owens, pulmonology. She's been at Harwick General 11 years. I know her. She's not it. How sure are you? Sure enough to use my name on it. She paused. Who's the charge nurse on the ICU floor tonight? A man named Ray Culver. He's been in that position for 4 years, Laura said. I know. She was quiet for a moment. He has scheduling access. He coordinates directly with the pharmacy on medication delivery timing for ICU patients. Reyes and Fallon exchanged a look that was brief enough to almost miss. We're aware of Culver, Fallon said. He's in the category of persons of interest that hasn't cleared to confirmed, but he hasn't cleared to eliminated either. No. Laura said nothing more on the subject. She filed it. The service entrance to Harwick General's basement level was a heavy steel door off an access road that ran behind the hospital's east wing. The convoy stopped short of it, two vehicles peeling off to hold positions at the perimeter. Laura went in with Fallon and Reyes and the young analyst, whose name turned out to be Garza, and who carried his laptop under one arm the way other people carried folders. The basement corridor was long and fluorescent and smelled of industrial cleaner, and the particular stale air of a building's lower level that never quite gets properly ventilated. Laura had been down here twice during her time at Harwick General, once for a facilities-oriented attention she'd barely paid attention to, and once when she'd taken a wrong turn looking for the records department during her first month. She remembered the layout better than she had any reason to, for someone who'd been here twice. They moved quickly. Fallon had a contact badge that opened the restricted access doors without triggering the standard audit log. She didn't ask how that worked, and he didn't explain it. Garza had his laptop open as they walked, monitoring the hospital's internal camera feeds from an external access point. Third-floor stairwell camera is offline, Garza said. Someone cut the feed from inside the building. 17 minutes ago. Fallon stopped walking. That's not us, Reyes said, already reaching for her radio. No, Fallon said. He looked at Laura. ICU is on the 4th floor. The stairwell between 3 and 4 is the fastest internal route from the pharmacy's storage to the ICU that avoids the main nursing station sightlines, she said immediately. He was already moving. The stairwell access was 30 feet ahead. They took it at a run-controlled, because speed without awareness in an enclosed stairwell was how you ran into something you weren't ready for. Laura was up the stairs between the 2nd and 3rd floors before she'd consciously decided to be muscle memory from a different life executing faster than thought. The door to the 3rd floor corridor was ajar. Fallon put his hand out, stopped. He looked through the gap. Then he pushed the door open slowly. The corridor was empty. The lights were at their standard overnight dim. The nurse's station for the 3rd floor, a general medical floor, not the ICU, was visible at the far end, and a single nurse was seated there, with her back to them, working at a terminal. On the floor, 6 feet from the stairwell door, was a small wheeled medication cart. It was the kind used by pharmacy staff for inter-department deliveries. It was unattended. The lock mechanism on the side panel was disengaged. Laura crouched next to it before Fallon could say anything. She looked at the panel without touching it. The lock's release lever had been manually overridden, the same type of bypass she'd identified on the medication cabinet in Trauma 2. Cart's upper tray held 3 sealed medication packets, labeled with patient identifiers from the ICU floor above. She looked at the labels. One of them was labeled with a patient identifier she recognized from the brief window she'd had into the hospital's system that evening. Daniel Marsh, ICU room 412. They're making another attempt, she said. Her voice came out level. Tonight. Right now. Fallon had his radio to his mouth before she finished the sentence. Communication that followed was clipped and fast, and she only caught the operational shorthand, but the result was immediate. She could hear movement from the floor above through the ceiling. The shift in ambient sound that comes when multiple people begin moving with purpose simultaneously. Stairs, Fallon said. They went up. The 4th floor ICU corridor was different from the 3rd, in the way that ICU floors are always different, quieter in some ways, louder in others, quietness of sleeping patients, offset by the continuous electronic vigilance of monitoring equipment. The overhead lights were dimmed to overnight levels. The nursing station was centrally positioned, visible from both ends of the main corridor. Ray Culver was standing at the nursing station when they came through the stairwell door. He was in his early 40s, a broad-shouldered man with a pleasant, forgettable face, who had spent 4 years running the ICU night rotation at Harwick General, with a reputation for being competent and undemanding. Laura had worked alongside him a handful of times on inter-department cases. He'd always been straightforward with her. Professional. He had the quality of someone you never quite looked at directly because there was never any particular reason to. He looked at Laura when she came through the door, then at Fallon, then at the two operators who had come up from a different access point and were now at the far end of the corridor. His face did something complicated. Not guilt, exactly. Closer to the expression of someone who has been holding a very specific kind of tension for a very long time and has just registered that the thing they were tensed against has arrived. Voss, he said, you're spending. I know. She kept walking toward him. Ray, where's the medication runner for tonight's ICU delivery? He didn't answer. The cart is on 3. The lock's been bypassed. One of those packets has Marcia's ID on it. She stopped at the edge of the nursing station. Where is the person who brought it up? His jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. You flagged the delivery window, Reyes said from behind Laura. She had her tablet out, turning it toward him. This is your access log. You opened the ICU medication delivery schedule at 11:47 tonight and adjusted the delivery window by 30 minutes. That's the window that Cart arrived in. Culver looked at the tablet. He looked at Reyes. He looked at Laura. And then, not with the dramatic collapse of someone caught in a movie, but with the specific, exhausted deflation of someone who has been running something too heavy for too long, his shoulders dropped. I didn't know they were going to try tonight, he said. I didn't know about the cart. But you opened the window, Laura said. I opened the window because I was told to. I was told? It was a scheduling correction. He looked at his hands on the nursing station counter. I wasn't supposed to be part of anything that... Who told you? Fallon said. Culver's eyes moved to Fallon, then away, then back. The calculation happening behind them was visible in the way that calculations are sometimes visible in people who are not practiced at hiding them, weighing what he knew against what he owed, against what was going to happen to him, regardless of what he chose in the next 30 seconds. Sims, he said. Albert Sims. He called me at 11. He told me there was a pharmacy scheduling error, and the delivery window needed to shift. That's all I did. That's all I was asked to do. That's not all you've been asked to do. Reyes said, not unkindly, but clearly. We have 11 weeks of communications, Ray. He closed his eyes. Laura looked away from him. She looked down the corridor toward room 412. The door was closed. The monitoring equipment for the room was visible on the ICU board. Marcia's vitals, tracking steady, completely unaware of what had just been moving toward him from the floor below. She thought about him on the table in trauma 2. His color, his pupils, the syringe in Greer's hand. She thought about the 3rd attempt in 6 weeks. She thought about 9 days to testimony. Is there anyone else in this building right now connected to this? She said, directing it at Fallon. We're running checks. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. He looked at her steadily. We don't have full visibility into the network yet. That's part of why we needed access to the building. The medication on that cart evidence team is already on 3. She nodded. She looked at Culver, who was now sitting heavily on the stool behind the nursing station, with the posture of someone who has been holding something upright by sheer effort and has finally set it down. He looked diminished, not sympathetic exactly, but smaller than the version of him she'd been building a picture of in the SUV. Ray. She waited until he looked at her. Were you in the medication room at 7:08 yesterday morning? He looked confused for a moment. Then he understood what she was asking. No, he said. I'm night rotation. I don't come in until 6 in the evening. So whoever put my badge number in that access log minus miss. I don't know anything about that. She believed him. Not because she was disposed toward believing him. She wasn't. Not anymore. Not tonight. But because the confusion on his face when she asked was the genuine confusion of someone encountering information for the first time, rather than the performed confusion of someone who has been caught in. Something adjacent to the thing they're being asked about. Which meant Sims or Greer or whoever had built the record against her had done it without Culver's knowledge. Which meant the network had internal partitions, each participant knowing only what they needed to know. Not the full architecture. Structure, she recognized. Not from hospitals, from other kinds of organized operations. The next 2 hours were methodical in a way that felt at odds with the speed at which the night had begun. Federal investigators who had been positioned in vehicles around the hospital perimeter began moving inside in shifts, carrying equipment in cases that looked like ordinary professional baggage. Garza set up a secondary monitoring point in an unused consultation room on the second floor. Reyes coordinated with a team Laura never saw, their presence inferred from the communications traffic she overheard and the periodic updates Fallon received on his radio. Laura was given a temporary access credential, a plain white badge with a federal identifier that opened the relevant doors without carrying any hospital affiliation. She used it to move through the floors she knew, and she moved through them the way she'd moved through every operational environment she'd ever been in looking for the things that weren't supposed to be there. She found the first one in the pharmacy storage room. It was a small device, magnetic-backed, attached to the underside of the secondary medication cabinet. Not a camera. A relay the kind used to intercept and duplicate electronic signals from a keypad or card reader. She didn't touch it. She photographed it with the phone Garza had issued her and sent the image to his system. His response came back in 40 seconds, consistent with what we've seen in 2 other hospital networks connected to this operation. Good find. She found the second thing 20 minutes later in the records office on the second floor. Folder physical, paper, kind of documentation that exists in hospital systems. Because electronic records have audit trails and paper, has different vulnerabilities containing printed copies of medication, dispensing logs with handwritten annotations in the margins. The annotations were in shorthand she didn't recognize, but the patient identifiers on the printed logs were recognizable. Marsh appeared 4 times. 3 other identifiers appeared in a pattern that, when she looked at the dates, corresponded to unexplained adverse events in the ICU over the previous 8 months. She stood in the records room and looked at those dates for a long time. Then she called Fallon. "I need someone in here now," she said. "And I need the mortality records for ICU patients over the last 8 months cross-referenced against these identifiers." There was a brief pause. "How many identifiers?" 3, beyond Marsh. Another pause. "Longer this time, Laura," Fallon said. His voice had changed quality, slightly, still controlled, but carrying something underneath the control. "Are you telling me this isn't just about the witness?" "I'm telling you," she said carefully, "that the records in this room suggest Daniel Marsh may not be the first patient someone tried to kill in this hospital. He may just be the first one anyone was looking for." She heard him relay something to someone off radio. She heard a response she couldn't make out. "Don't touch anything else," he said. "We're sending a forensics team to your location." "I'm not done looking." "Laura, I'll tell them where I was when they get here." She put the phone in her pocket and kept moving. By 4 in the morning, she had been back inside Harwick General for nearly 2 hours, and she could feel it in the way you feel long nights when you're past 40. Not in a dramatic way, just a low-grade awareness of the body's accounting, the cost of the previous 24 hours, starting to present itself quietly at the edges of her attention. She'd been fired, escorted out, driven across a nighttime city, walked back into the same building, and spent two hours moving through it, looking for things that turned out to be there. She found herself in the stairwell between 2 and 3, sitting on a step, drinking bad coffee from a paper cup that Garza had produced from somewhere without being asked. She didn't remember deciding to sit down. Her body had apparently made the decision independently. Thought about the 3 patient identifiers in the records office. She thought about 8 months of unexplained adverse events. She thought about the particular configuration of what she was looking at, not a panicked improvisation around a single witness, but something that had been running longer, something with established protocols and internal partitions and relay devices bolted under medication cabinets. Something that had been using Harwick General as infrastructure for a while before Daniel Marsh arrived on the 4th floor. The door above her opened. Reyes came down 2 flights and sat beside her on the step without asking or announcing. She had her own coffee. She looked like someone who was used to 4 in the morning. The forensics team found a second relay device, Reyes said. ICU medroom. How long has it been there? Based on the dust accumulation around the mount, they're estimating 4 to 6 months. Laura drank her coffee. Greer has been chief trauma attending for 6 years, she said. Yes. Sims has been chief pharmacist for 5. Yes. And nobody was looking, Reyes said. Not defensively, just factually. When you're not looking for something, the absence of evidence reads as absence of the thing. Laura thought about that. I looked, she said. Yesterday morning in Trauma 2, I looked, and they fired me for it. Reyes was quiet for a moment. I know, that's not a complaint. I'm just noting that the system for managing the person who noticed was apparently already in place. Yes. We think the falsified access log and the badge timestamp were components of a prepared response protocol. If someone in the clinical setting raised a concern about the medication, there was already a mechanism ready to discredit them. How many times had they used it before? Reyes looked at her coffee. We don't know yet. But it's possible. This isn't the first nurse or doctor they've discredited. Possible. Laura was quiet for a long time. The stairwell was very still. Somewhere above them, 4 floors up, Daniel Marsh was breathing through a ventilator, alive because she had reached for a syringe that she had no official authority to stop and had said 4 words clearly enough that they'd been heard even by a room that had decided she wasn't worth listening to. She thought about those words. Do not give him that. The specific flatness of her own voice, saying them. Specific contempt on Greer's face in the 2 seconds before he did it anyway. She thought about what it had cost her. She thought about what it had revealed. They didn't know who I was, she said. When they built the response protocol, they built it for a nurse, not for whatever my file says I am. No, Reyes said. They didn't. Laura set down the empty cup. That's a significant operational error on their part, she said. Reyes looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile. Yes, she said. It is. Laura stood. She rolled her shoulders once, the quiet recalibration of someone organizing themselves for the next phase of something that wasn't finished yet, y'all. She was about to push the stairwell door open when Garza's voice came through the radio Fallon had given her. Clipped and suddenly tense in a way that cut through the 4 in the morning, quiet like something cold. We have a problem. The camera system just came back online. Someone inside the building restored the deleted footage. All of it. The full 11 days. A pause. And someone accessed it from inside the network 3 minutes ago. From a terminal on the 4th floor. Laura's hand stopped on the door. Which terminal? Reyes said. ICU nursing station, Garza said. The login used was Ray Culver's credentials. Reyes turned to look at Laura. Culver is downstairs in a secured room, Laura said. He has been for 2 hours. Yes, Garza said. He has. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Someone just used his credentials, Laura said slowly, from the ICU nursing station. Right now. While he's in a secured room. Yes. Which means someone else has his login, Reyes said. She was already moving. Someone who is currently on the 4th floor and doesn't know we're here. Laura pushed the door open and went through it at a run, the stairwell echoing behind her. 4 floors of steel and concrete between her and whatever was waiting at the top, the night suddenly reshaping itself around a new axis entirely. Took the stairs 2 at a time. Not running blind, she was tracking the floor count, tracking the sound ahead of her, tracking the weight of behind her, and the radio traffic Reyes behind her, and the radio coming through the earpiece. Fallon had clipped to her collar 20 minutes ago. The stairwell acoustics were the hollow, resonant kind that amplified footfall and breath and the distant mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system into something that felt larger than it was. She used that. Listened through it for anything that didn't belong. 4 flights. She hit the 4th floor door at pace and stopped with her hand on the bar, not pushing yet. Pressed her back against the door and looked at Reyes. Reyes held up 2 fingers. Pointed left. Then right. 2 directions to cover from the stairwell exit, both leading toward the ICU nursing station from opposite ends of the corridor. Laura pushed through. The fourth-floor corridor at 4:17 in the morning was dim and quiet and smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. The ICU nursing station was 40 feet ahead, curved desk illuminated by monitor glow, the overhead corridor lighting at overnight setting enough to see clearly, not enough to feel fully awake in. 2 patient rooms on the left, their monitoring feeds visible on the station board. Room 412 was third on the right, door closed. Marsh's vitals steady on the board from where Laura stood. The nursing station appeared empty. She moved toward it. The station had 3 terminals. 2 of them were in screensaver mode. The third, the one farthest us left, facing the corridor, had an active session open. The screen showed the hospital's internal security camera management interface. The footage restoration Garza had flagged was visible on the interface. 11 days of files, re-indexed, active. The session was logged in under Ray Culver's credentials. The chair in front of it was pushed back at an angle, still slightly moving. Laura looked at it, looked at the corridor to her left, which bent around toward the service elevator in the secondary supply room. Looked at the door of the medication preparation room, adjacent to the nursing station, a small enclosed room with a keypad entry, used by ICU nurses to draw up and verify medications before administration. The keypad light was green. It had been accessed recently enough that the auto-lock hadn't re-engaged. She looked at Reyes, who had come in from the opposite end of the corridor and was now positioned at the edge of the nursing station. She pointed at the medication room door. Reyes nodded and moved left, angling to cover the corridor approach. Laura moved to the medication room. She pushed the door. The room was small, 8 feet by 10, standard ICU medication preparation space. Counter along 3 walls. 2 locked medication cabinets on the right. A laminar flow hood in the far corner for sterile preparation. Overhead fluorescent, the harsh white kind that made everyone look slightly unwell. A woman was standing at the left counter with her back to the door. She was in scrubs, dark green, the color used by the hospital's overnight pharmacy delivery staff rather than the ICU nurses. Medium height, mid-30s, brown hair pulled back. She was working at the counter with both hands, and she didn't turn around immediately when Laura pushed the door open, which told Laura either she hadn't heard it or she was processing a decision. The woman turned. Laura recognized her. Not well she was from the pharmacy department, not a face Laura had interacted with regularly. She'd seen her in the corridors, in the cafeteria. Her name tag read K. Pruitt. On the counter in front of Pruitt were 2 items, an open medication vial and a syringe, partially drawn. The syringe was not labeled. "Step away from the counter," Laura said. Pruitt looked at her. Her expression was not the expression of someone caught doing something wrong. It was something stranger, a kind of flat, overloaded calm, the expression of someone who has been running on stress hormones for so long that the alarm system has stopped producing new signals. "I work here," Pruitt said. "I know." "Step away from the counter." "You're the nurse who was suspended." "Yes." Laura moved into the room, putting herself between Pruitt and the door, keeping her eyes on the syringe and the vial without fixating on either. "What's in that vial?" "It's a scheduled medication for the patient. In 412. Put it down and step back. I have authorizations." "From whom?" Laura kept her voice flat. "Culver is downstairs. Sims went home at 8. Who authorized a medication preparation in this room at 4 in the morning?" Pruitt's jaw tightened. Her hands were still near the counter. "Put the syringe down," Laura said. "Right now. Just set it on the counter and step back. That's all." Something shifted in Pruitt's posture, a small collapse, like a cable going slack. She set the syringe down. She stepped back. She pressed herself against the far counter and looked at the floor. Reyes was in the doorway 2 seconds later. "Don't touch the vial," Laura said to her without turning. Either of them. "Get Garza up here with an evidence kit." Reyes was already on the radio. Laura looked at Pruitt. "Who contacted you tonight?" Pruitt shook her head. "Not Culver. He's been isolated for 2 hours. Not Sims, we have coverage on him." She watched Pruitt's face while she said it. "So who gave you the instruction?" Pruitt looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed in the fluorescence light, and Laura realized she had been crying recently, not now, but recently. The particular rawness around the eyes of someone who cried alone and then had to keep functioning. They told me it was the last time, Pruitt said. Her voice came out thinner than her posture suggested. They said if I did this one thing, it was finished. My involvement was finished. Who is they? She pressed her lips together. Pruitt. Laura kept her voice even. Whatever they told you, you're standing in a room with a federal witness's medication and an unlabeled syringe at 4 a.m. That's the situation you're in right now. The only variable you control from this point forward is whether you help us understand how you got here. A long pause. The ventilation hummed. From somewhere in the corridor, the soft alarm of a monitoring system registered a minor variance and then self-corrected. Greer, Pruitt said, very quietly. He called me at midnight. They moved Pruitt to the consultation room on the second floor, where Culver was all she's sitting. Not together opposite sides of the room. No communication between them. Garza had an evidence kit open on the medication room counter upstairs. Reyes was coordinating with the perimeter team. The vial and the syringe were bagged and labeled at 4:31 in the morning by a forensics technician who worked with the efficiency of someone who had been awake for this long before and would be again. Fallon found Laura in the 4th floor corridor outside 412, standing at the door but not going in. The vial, he said. Preliminary field test. What was it? Potassium chloride. Concentration approximately 4 times the therapeutic ceiling. He said it without editorializing. Just the information laid flat. Administered IV to a sedated patient on ventilator support, that concentration would produce cardiac arrest within 3 to 5 minutes. Presentation would be consistent with natural deterioration. Laura looked at the door of room 412, 4 times the therapeutic ceiling, into a sedated man whose ventilator would have kept breathing for him while his heart stopped. In the middle of the night, on a floor, with minimal staff documented as a scheduled medication delivery. They would have called it a complication, she said. Yes. And the investigation would have looked at his trauma injuries, his pressure instability from the day before, and found a plausible physiological explanation. He looked at her. It's what they did with the others. She turned. You confirmed the other identifiers from the records room. 2 of the 3 are confirmed adverse events that were closed as natural deterioration. The 3rd is still being reviewed. He paused. One of them was 8 months ago. One was 4 months ago. 8 months. 4 months. Last night. A pattern with an accelerating interval. Greer signed the death certificates, she said. It wasn't a question. On 2 of them, yes. The 3rd was a different attending, but the pharmacy records show Sims managed the medication delivery on all 3. Laura thought about Greer's face in trauma too. The slow clap in the corridor. 2 full seconds he'd spent looking at the syringe before he administered it anyway. She had read that 2 seconds as arrogance at the time. She understood now. It had been something colder, a man who had made a calculation and found the math satisfactory. Recruit them, she said. Sims, Culver, Pruitt. We don't have the full picture yet. Pruitt is talking. Based on what she said so far, it sounds like leverage. She made a documentation error 18 months ago that Greer had record of. He offered her a choice. And Culver? Financial. He's been running debt for 3 years. The amounts deposited into his account correspond to the dates of the adverse events. And Sims? Fallon was quiet for a moment. Sims is a more complicated picture. We think he may have been involved before Greer. The relay device in the pharmacy storage, the dust accumulation, puts its installation earlier than Greer's confirmed involvement with the network. She looked at him. Sims may be the connection to the network itself, Fallon said. Greer may be the mechanism inside the hospital, but Sims may be the reason the hospital was selected in the first place. Laura stood with that for a moment. Marsh was placed in Crestholm 14 months ago, she said. Yes. And the first adverse event in those records was 8 months ago. Yes. So Sims had 6 months after Marsh's placement to establish the mechanism before the first attempt. That's the current working theory. She looked down the corridor. You need Sims tonight, before morning rounds, before Greer comes back in. We're moving on Sims at 6. That's 90 minutes. I know. And Greer, if he comes in at 7 and finds, we'll have what we need from Sims before Greer arrives. He said it with the confidence of someone who believes the plan, but knows plans have edges. Ideally. She heard the word ideally and filed it. I want to check on Marsh, she said. Fallon looked at the door, then back at her. He nodded. Room 412 was quiet in the way of rooms where someone is working very hard at staying alive without being conscious of doing it. The ventilator marked time in steady mechanical rhythm. The monitoring equipment ran its continuous assessment, translating the body's internal language into numbers and waveforms on a screen. An IV line ran from the overhead pole to the back of Marsh's left hand, secured with white tape. He was a large man. She could see that even lying down, even diminished by the apparatus of intensive care around him. Big hands, weathered in the way of someone who had worked outdoors for years before. Whatever his life had been turned into something else. There was a bruise across his left temple from the original trauma, faded now to yellow-green at the edges. Chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm. She stood at the bedside for a moment. She wasn't sure exactly why she'd needed to come in. Clinical assessment. His numbers were visible on the board outside. There was nothing she could tell from being in the room that she couldn't have told from the corridor. It wasn't that. She looked at his hands. She thought about the files Reyes had shown her. 14 months in witness protection. 14 months of being someone else in a city that wasn't his. Building a case that had apparently made enough people nervous that 3 attempts had been made on his life, and a 4th had been in progress as of 4 hours ago. She thought about the 2 patients in those records who hadn't made it. She put 2 fingers to the inside of Marsh's wrist, the pulse point below the thumb, the one she'd learned to use in conditions where monitoring equipment wasn't an option. His pulse was slow and regular. Stronger than she expected, actually. There was something persisting in the body of this man that multiple careful, organized attempts has not been able to extinguish. Stepped back from the bed. She looked at the IV line. Connector point at the port, closest the hand. She leaned forward without touching it, examining the seal. It was intact. The port cap was correctly seated. She looked at it for another second. Then she looked at the second port, higher up the line. Cap was slightly off-center. Not dislodged, the seal was still closed. But the positioning was different from the lower port, and different from how it had looked in the brief view she'd had of the room's camera feed earlier. She straightened. She stepped into the corridor and found Fallon. Someone accessed his IV line, she said. The upper port on his primary line. Cap has been disturbed. Fallon looked at her for 1 second. Then he was on the radio, and the forensics technician who had been finishing up in the medication room was in room 412 within 3 minutes, and what she found when she tested the port seal required a second field test to confirm, because the first result was the kind that people want to be wrong about. The port had been injected through the cap. The seal showed micropuncture consistent with a fine-gauge needle. Whatever had been introduced into the line was already in the tubing between the port and the patient's hand. Garza ran the math on the drip rate and the line volume. Based on his calculations, the substance introduced at the upper port would reach the IV insertion point in approximately 22 minutes from the time of the puncture, and based on the timeline they had Pruitt in the medication room. Culver's credentials as accessed at the nursing station, the puncture had likely occurred before either of those events, before they'd even reached the 4th floor. A diversion, both of them. The cart on 3, Reyes said from the doorway. Her voice had the quality of someone recalculating something fast. Credentials accessed at the station. Pruitt in the medication room. All of it diversion. Get people looking at the entry points, the 4th floor access. And we miss whoever was already in this room. How long ago? Fallon said to Garza. Based on drip rate and line volume, Garza looked at his numbers. He looked up. 18 to 20 minutes ago, which puts the substance reaching the insertion point in 2 to 4 minutes, Laura said. She was already at the bedside. She had the IV line in her hands, and she was not thinking about authorization or protocol or the fact that she was technically suspended from a hospital that was now a federal crime scene. She was thinking about the line volume and the drip rate and the 2 to 4 minutes, and her hands thumb moved with the specific economy of someone who has performed this action under conditions that were significantly worse than this. Clamped the line above the upper port and disconnected it at the patient's hand in a single clean motion. She recapped the insertion point. She reached for the supply tray at the bedside, opened a sealed IV kit, and established a new line from the unopened bag on the secondary pole, the one that had not been accessed. It took her 90 seconds. The forensics technician was standing beside her the entire time, and she said very quietly, that was the right call. Laura set down the supplies. Her hands were steady. She looked at Marsh's monitoring screen. His vitals had not changed. He was still here. She stepped back from the bed. Her hands were steady, but her heart rate was not, and she was aware of that discrepancy with the specific awareness of someone who has learned to let the body run its own accounting while the mind keeps working. She breathed out slowly and looked at the new line, the sealed port, the clean tubing, carrying nothing but saline solution from an unopened bag. 2 to 4 minutes. She thought about that for a moment. 2 to 4 minutes from a quiet room in the middle of the night and a man dying in a way that looked like natural deterioration from trauma injuries. No alarm, no scene, no evidence of intervention at all, unless you were looking for the right kind of wrongness in the right places. She thought about the fact that nobody in this hospital, in 23 months of her working here, had ever thought she was the right kind of person to look for those things. At 5:40 in the morning, 3 things happened in a sequence rapid enough that the interval between them was measured in minutes rather than anything longer. First was that Albert Sims, the chief pharmacist of Harwick General, was arrested at his home on Ferris Boulevard while he was in the process of shredding document in his home office. The federal team covering his location had been watching him move through his house for the previous 40 minutes. He had activated his shredder at 5:37, which the team's technical surveillance had flagged. Immediately, they went in at 5:40. The shredder contained partially destroyed records that the forensics team later reconstructed into a communication log spanning 14 months, connecting Sims to a network whose operational reach extended significantly beyond Harwick General Hospital in Crestholm. The second was that Garza, running an analysis of the network's encrypted communications with the partial decryption key recovered from Sims's home router, identified a message sent at 3:52 that morning, while Laura and Reyes had been in the stairwell, while the SUVs were still positioned on the perimeter, from inside the hospital network to an outside receiver. The message was 4 words: 4th floor is compromised. Someone inside the building had sent a warning to the network at 3:52. Not Culver, not Pruitt, neither of them had been in a position to send anything at 3:52. Third thing was that Garza cross-referenced the terminal used to send the message with the hospital's internal session logs and identified the workstation, a terminal in the trauma surgery attend's private office on the 2nd floor. The session had been opened using a remote access credential registered to Nathan Greer, and it had been active according to the log since 2:45 in the morning. Greer had never gone home. His car was in the hospital's physician parking structure. Level 2, Space 14, a dark blue sedan that Garza pulled up on the structure's internal camera feed within 90 seconds of the terminal identification. Car had been in that space since the previous morning. It had not moved. Fallon said very calmly, and with the specific controlled quality of someone revising an operational picture in real time, he's been in the building this whole time. Yes, Garza said. Which means he was here when we came in. Yes. And he sent the warning at 3:52 because he saw us on the cameras. The security camera management interface he accessed from the 2nd floor terminal has a view of the service entrance. You came in at 2:46. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. Laura said, "Where is he now?" Garza was already running the current camera feeds from the second floor. Terminal in the attending office dark. The corridor outside empty. The elevator lobby empty. The secondary stairwell on the west side of the building. West stairwell camera is offline, Garza said. He said it with the measured voice of someone delivering bad information to people who need to keep functioning. It went offline 4 minutes ago. The west stairwell was on the opposite side of the building from the stairwell Laura had used to reach the 4th floor. It was also the most direct internal route from the 2nd floor to the hospital's basement level. The basement level had 2 exits, the service entrance, which had federal coverage, and the loading dock access on the building's north face, which connected to an alley running between the hospital and the adjacent parking structure. Fallon looked at Laura. She was already moving. She went left down the 4th floor corridor, away from the nursing station, toward the west end of the building. She knew this floor's layout. She knew every floor's layout, because knowing the layout of the spaces she worked in was the kind of habit that never stopped being a habit, regardless of how civilian the environment. The west stairwell door was 80 feet ahead. She covered it in less time than she would have measured. She hit the door and went through without stopping. The stairwell was empty above her. She looked down. 3 floors below, at the bottom of the stairwell, a door was just closing. She heard the specific mechanical thud of a fire door, catching in its frame, and she went down the stairs at a pace that was below running and above controlled, the pace of someone moving fast enough to matter without losing the precision that fast movement requires. Basement level. She hit the door and pushed through into the corridor. The basement corridor stretched ahead of her, long and fluorescent and echoing. She could hear footfall ahead, fast, not quite running. The footfall of someone moving with urgency through a space they'd been through before. She ran. The corridor bent left. She followed it. Ahead, the loading dock access a wide corridor, terminating at a heavy roll-up door that was currently in the closed position, and beside it a standard personnel door that opened outward to the north alley. Personnel door was swinging shut. She hit it shoulder first and came out into the alley. The alley was dark. Narrow, maybe 12 feet between the hospital's north wall and the concrete face of the adjacent parking structure. Overhead, the gap of sky between the 2 buildings was the deep blue-gray of very early morning. The city not yet light, but no longer fully dark, that particular quality of 4 to 5 in the morning that is neither one thing nor another. Greer was 20 feet ahead of her. He was moving fast, heading for the alley's east end, where it opened onto the side street. He was wearing his hospital ID badge on a lanyard that swung as he ran, which struck her as a strange detail to notice, and she noticed it anyway. He hadn't heard her yet. The door behind her had closed quietly, and her footfall on the alley's concrete was controlled. She ran harder. He heard her at 15 feet. He turned without fully stopping a mid-stride turn that cost him momentum, and for a moment she saw his face clearly in the ambient light. Nathan Greer, chief trauma surgeon, who had made slow clapping sounds while she picked instruments off the floor, who had looked at a syringe she'd told him was wrong and used it anyway, whose face, in trauma 2 with a resuscitation in progress, had been doing 2 calculations simultaneously. His face now was doing only 1. He turned back and accelerated toward the end of the alley. He didn't make it. The 2 federal operators who had repositioned to the alley's east end, based on Fallon's radio call 30 seconds earlier, were simply there when he arrived. He pulled up short with the specific physical jolt of someone who has been running at full speed and encountered something immovable. One of the operators said something clipped and professional. Greer turned. The alley exit on the west end had Laura. Stood between them. His breathing was audible. His hospital ID badge still swayed slightly on the lanyard. Laura stopped 8 feet from him and looked at him. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be, and her left knee was reminding her of something it had been reminding her of for years, and she was aware of both of those things and set them both aside. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, not the contempt from the corridor, not the cold calculation from trauma 2, but something more exposed, particular expression of a man who has just run out of moves and knows it, and hasn't yet decided what to do with that knowledge. Voss, he said. He was still breathing hard. She said nothing. You don't, he stopped. Started again. You have no idea how complicated this. Put your hands where I can see them, she said. He looked at her for one more second. Then he looked at the operators behind him. He put his hands up. The operators moved forward. She stepped back. She watched them manage it with the efficiency of people who had done this before, and she kept her eyes at Greer's face through the whole of it. Not because she needed to, but because she had been looking at that face for 2 years from the position of someone he had decided was not worth seeing. And she found that she was not willing to look away from it now. One of the operators produced restraints. Greer's jaw was working, like he was preparing to say something, some version of the thing that people in his position often said at this moment, the thing about lawyers and due process, and how none of this was what it looked like. She had heard versions of it before, in different contexts, from different people who had built different structures of harm around themselves, and were now watching those structures come apart. Opened his mouth. The radio in Laura's earpiece activated. Psst. Garza's voice tight and fast. Voss, we have a problem. The ICU board just flagged a critical alarm in room 412. Marcia's pressure is dropping, and the overnight attending can't explain why. She had established a new IV line. She had capped the compromised port. She had watched his vitals hold steady as recently as 15 minutes ago. What's his pressure, she said. Systolic 82 and falling. A pause. Garza's pulling the monitoring record. The drop started 7 minutes ago. Before we had him in the alley. Before you changed the line. 7 minutes ago. Before. She was already running back toward the personnel door. Before Garza finished the sentence. The alley behind her. The basement corridor ahead. The stairwell. 4 floors. 82 systolic and falling. And the specific cold arithmetics of 7 minutes ago, landing in her chest like a diagnosis she hadn't seen coming. The personnel door hit the wall when she came through it. Basement corridor, full sprint now, the fluorescent lights strobing past overhead in her peripheral vision. Her footfall loud and uneven on the concrete, because she wasn't managing how she sounded anymore. She was managing speed, and the stairwell door was 30 feet ahead, and she hit it without slowing and took the stairs the way she'd taken them an hour ago, going down controlled enough not to fall, fast enough to matter. First floor, second, third, fourth. She came through the 4th floor stairwell door, and the ICU nursing station was immediately visible, and the situation at the nursing station was immediately readable. Dr. Tricia Owens, the overnight pulmonology attending, was on the phone at the station with the focused urgency of someone managing something she doesn't understand. 2 ICU nurses were moving toward room 412. The monitoring board showed Marcia's systolic at 79. Laura moved past all of them. Voss, you can't be in here. I know, she said, without stopping. She went into room 412. The room had the quality of a space where something is happening that the machines can see, but the people can't yet explain. The ventilator was cycling normally. The IV line she'd established was intact. The saline drip running clear. His pulse ox was holding at 91. But his pressure was wrong, 79 systolic on the monitor, and she could see the waveform flattening in a way that meant the number was heading lower, not stabilizing. She looked at him. She looked at the bed. She looked at the position of his body under the blanket, pulled the blanket back. His left leg, the one closest to the wall, was swollen from mid-thigh to knee. The swelling had the tight, shiny quality of something that had developed over hours, not minutes. The skin over the medial thigh was discolored in a way that was subtle in the overhead light, but distinct when you were looking for it. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to the area. He was sedated and therefore couldn't respond, but the tissue response under her fingers told her what she needed to know. Fluctuant, warm, a specific texture of a hematoma with active bleeding inside it. Not a new injury, this had been developing since the original trauma, a deep muscular hematoma from the impact that had been underassessed in the chaos of the initial admission, and it had been bleeding slowly enough to stay below the threshold of clinical alarm until the cumulative blood loss crossed a line sometime in the last 45 minutes. This was not an attempt on his life. This was his body. Doing what bodies after significant trauma, when the initial crisis consumed all the attention and the secondary complications waited quietly in the background for their turn. He straightened. Dr. Owens was in the doorway. What are you looking at? Left thigh hematoma. It's been expanding. He's losing volume internally. Laura looked at the monitor. 77 systolic now. He needs a surgical consult and imaging. Ultrasound first. If the hematoma has a feeding vessel, he may need embolization. Owens came into the room and looked at the leg. Her expression went through a fast sequence: skepticism, assessment, recognition. How long? Based on the size, it's been expanding for at least 6 hours. The pressure drop is consistent with the cumulative loss. She looked at Owens. He's not being poisoned. He's bleeding. And it's going to keep going until someone deals with the vessel. Owens was already on the phone. Laura stepped back from the bed and let her work, stood at the foot of the bed and felt the particular physical sensation of adrenaline that has nowhere to go, the body mobilized for something that turned out to require a different response entirely. The recalibration happening in real time. She looked at Marcia's face, still, pale in the overhead light, but not the wrong kind of pale. Chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm. He was still here. She walked out of the room. Fallon was at the nursing station when she came out. Greer had been handed off to additional federal personnel in the parking structure. Hacks. Fallon had come back up. He looked at her face and waited. Expanding hematoma, she said. Trauma complication. Not the network. He absorbed this. He'll survive it. Owens is getting surgical imaging. They move on it in the next hour? Yes. She leaned against the nursing station counter. The overhead lights hummed. The drop in his pressure wasn't another attempt. It was his injuries, running their own course. So the timing, coincidence, bad one. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. The network's fourth attempt failed. The 3 items in that room, the credentials, Pruitt, the IV port, those were all coordinated. They just didn't account for the fact that we'd already reached the 4th floor before any of them could complete. Fallon was quiet for a moment. The port injection, if you hadn't caught it. Caught it. I know. I know what you're saying. She looked at him. It worked out. Let's talk about what's still unresolved. He nodded. Professional enough to take the redirect without making it a conversation. Sims is in federal custody, he said. He stopped cooperating approximately 18 minutes after arrest. His attorney was contacted at 5:52. Greer is being processed. He hasn't said a single word since the alley. A pause. Culver and Pruitt are both talking, but their knowledge of the network's external structure is limited. They knew Greer. They knew Sims. They knew what they were asked to do. They did not know why Marsh specifically was a target or who was giving the ultimate instructions. Communication log from Sims's router. We have the partial decryption. It's enough to establish the network's existence and Harwick General's role in it. It's not enough to identify the top-level principal. Laura straightened. Sims is the connection. You said he was involved before Greer, that the hospital may have been selected because of him. That's the working theory. Then, the principal didn't recruit Sims. Sims was already connected to the principal when the hospital was selected. She thought about it. Which means Sims's prior history, before Harwick General, is where you find the link. Fallon looked at her with the expression of someone who has been thinking along the same line and has hit a wall somewhere on it. His prior employment. He spent 11 years at a hospital in Dormer City before coming to Crestholm. We're running that now. What made him leave Dormer City? Officially, a career opportunity. The Harwick General position was a step up in title, and unofficially, there was a malpractice complaint filed against the pharmacy department in Dormer City 22 months before Sims transferred. It was settled quietly. Sims was named in the initial filing, but not in the settlement documentation. She looked at him. What kind of malpractice complaint? Medication error. Patient fatality. He paused. The patient was a federal informant who had been placed in the Dormer City area. The corridor was very quiet. The monitoring equipment ran its continuous measurements. Somewhere down the hall, Dr. Owens was coordinating surgical imaging for a man with a bleeding hematoma who was, despite everything that had been arranged against him, still alive. Laura said, "This isn't the first hospital." "No," Fallon said. "We don't think it is." By 6:30 in the morning, the second shift of federal investigators had arrived, and the first shift was transitioning out with the particular haggard efficiency of people who had been working since before midnight and were running on the last reserves of professional function. The hospital's administrative leadership had been contacted. The board chairman, a man named Gerald Vance, who was currently driving in from his home in the suburbs with a specific expression, Laura imagined of someone who had received a phone call that restructured his entire morning, was expected on sex on site within the hour. The hospital itself was still running. Patients in beds, monitors cycling, the morning routine of a large emergency facility, continuing in parallel with everything happening in its administrative layer. Laura found that aspect of it strange in a way she couldn't quite articulate the fact that the hospital kept functioning regardless of what was being discovered inside it. The ER downstairs was still receiving ambulances, and the morning nursing shift was still handing off from overnight, and breakfast trays were being assembled in the kitchen. She was standing in the consultation room on the second floor, the same one where Culver and Pruitt had been held separately through the night, now empty, drinking her second cup of bad coffee and watching the sky outside the window move from dark blue to the gray-orange of early morning when Reyes found her. Reyes sat down in the chair across the table without preamble. "How are you doing?" she said. Laura looked at her. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." A pause. Laura set the coffee down. She looked at the window. Parking structure across the way was becoming visible in the growing light concrete levels, a handful of early arriving cars. The dark blue sedan on level 2, space 14, that had been sitting in that spot since the previous morning. "I'm functional," she said. "I'll be fine after I sleep." "When did you last sleep?" "Before 2:14 this morning." Reyes nodded as if this were a satisfactory clinical answer, which it wasn't. But she apparently understood when to let a line of inquiry go. "Garza pulled something," Reyes said, "from the Dormer City records. I thought you should hear it directly." Laura looked at her. The malpractice complaint from Dormer City. The one filed against the pharmacy department 22 months before Sims transferred. Reyes had her tablet on the table, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at Laura. The complaint was filed by a nurse in the hospital's critical care unit. She identified a pattern of medication anomalies across 3 patient deaths over a 14-month period. She was dismissed before the complaint was formally investigated. Dismissed on what grounds? The hospital cited performance deficiencies and a pattern of insubordinate behavior. Reyes paused. The specific incident cited in her termination was that she had allegedly interfered with a medication administration during a patient's critical event and had been told by the attending physician to step back. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle. Pecked. Laura looked at it. "She was doing the same thing I did," she said. "Yes. In Dormer City. 14 months before Sims transferred here." "Yes. And after she was dismissed, the complaint went nowhere, and Sims was eventually transferred to a higher title position in a new city. The settlement agreement included a non-disclosure clause for all named parties. The nurse couldn't speak publicly about what she'd seen. The hospital's documentation of the events was sealed. Reyes was watching her carefully. She's been working as a home health aide in Dormer City for the past 18 months. She lost her nursing license as part of the settlement. Laura was quiet for a long time. She thought about the instruments on the floor. The slow clap, 2 years of eating lunch alone. The white badge at the bottom of her locker that she'd been looking at for 30 seconds every morning, and then closing the door on. She thought about a woman in Dormer City who had noticed the same things, in the same order, and had paid the same price, and had paid it alone. No federal task force showing up at 2 in the morning, and no classified file full of the right context. "What's her name?" Laura said. "Margaret Olson. Does she know what's happening here?" "Not yet." Laura picked up her coffee. "She should." "I agree." Reyes waited a moment. "I wanted you to know about her before the morning briefing, because the morning briefing is going to cover some things that are going to be significant, and I thought the context mattered." Laura looked at her. What kind of significant? Reyes finally looked at her tablet. Communication log from Sims's router. Garza has been running the decryption through the night. As of 40 minutes ago, they have enough to establish that the network operating through Harwick General and presumably through Dormer City before it is connected to a federal investigation that's been running for 2 years. The network is using hospital infrastructure to eliminate witnesses because hospitals are controlled environments with plausible natural explanations for patient deaths. Harwick General was not selected randomly. It was selected because Sims was already here, and because Marsh was placed here, and because the combination created an opportunity. How many hospitals total? That's what the morning briefing is going to address. She closed the tablet. The number we have right now is not a small one. Laura looked out the window. The parking structure was fully visible now, the dawn having made its mind up about arriving. Crow was sitting on the concrete barrier of level 3, absolutely motionless, looking at something in the alley below with the absolute certainty of something that knows exactly where it is and what it's doing there. She thought about the architecture of what she'd walked into when she walked into Trauma 2 yesterday morning. Not a local conspiracy, not a corrupt doctor and a compromised pharmacist and a couple of recruited staff members. A system. Something with infrastructure and protocols and prepared response mechanisms, the falsified access logs, the ready-made scapegoat process, the ability to move on a new asset in a new city after the previous location became untenable. She thought about the fact that none of that system had accounted for her specifically. It had accounted for a nurse, for a civilian healthcare worker who could be discredited and dismissed and would have no particular recourse once the records were adjusted. The prepared response had been built for that person, and that person was who she had been in every respect from the outside. "The morning briefing," she said. "Who's running it?" "Fallon. In the hospital's main conference room. Administration is being included." Reyes stood. "Starts in 22 minutes. Laura finished her coffee. She set the cup down. She stood, and something in her lower back registered the night's accumulated cost with a dull, specific complaint that she noted and ignored. "One more thing," Reyes said at the door. Laura looked at her. "Your termination documentation, the hospital's official record of your dismissal. Garza pulled the full file an hour ago." She paused. The performance deficiency report that Greer filed was backdated. Timestamps on the original documents were altered. The file also contains a secondary memo, not visible in the standard HR interface, flagged with a pharmacy department cross-reference. She looked at Laura steadily. It's the same structure used in the Dormer City termination. Same fields, same formatting, same cross-reference methodology. Different names, different dates, identical architecture. Laura absorbed this. "They had a template," she said. "Yes. For discrediting the person who noticed." "Yes." She stood with that for a moment. The specific weight of it, not the anger, which was there but not the loudest thing, but the structural clarity of it. The fact that the mechanism for eliminating her had been built before she had done anything, before she had noticed anything, because a system that had been running long enough developed protocols for the predictable obstacles. And she had been a predictable obstacle. She found, unexpectedly, that she wasn't sure how to feel about that. There was something almost not satisfying, exactly, but clarifying. The thing that had looked like targeted malice turned out to be a standardized process, and that reframing changed it from personal to systemic, and systemic she knew how to deal with. She had been trained in another life to deal specifically with systems. Conference room on the third floor of Harwick General seated 24. 7:03 in the morning it held 11 people. Fallon at the head of the table, Reyes and Garza on one side, 3 federal investigators Laura hadn't been formally introduced to on the other. Gerald Vance, the board chairman, at the far end, with the expression of a man who had aged several years in transit. 2 members of the hospital's legal team who had arrived simultaneously with Vance and immediately taken positions flanking him. And Laura, she sat in a chair near the middle of the table, not at the head and not at the end, because she was not running this meeting and she was not the institutional representative being briefed. Fallon laid it out in the order it needed to be laid out. The network, the methodology, the 3 confirmed attempts on Marsh's life, and the 4th interdicted during the night. The deaths in Dormer City, the preliminary findings connecting both locations to a broader operational structure. He was precise and efficient, and he covered the ground without editorial comment, which was the right approach for a room that included Gerald Vance, whose legal team was visibly and continuously assessing each statement for institutional exposure. When Fallon covered the falsified documentation, the backdated termination file, the template structure shared between Harwick General and the Dormer City incident, Vance said, "I was not informed of this." "No," Fallon said. "You weren't. The termination of Nurse Voss was processed through the standard administrative channel. I was given no indication that the supporting documentation had been—" Mr. Vance. Fallon said it without edge. "The documentation was designed to pass through standard administrative review without triggering scrutiny. That's the point of the template. We're not here to discuss your institutional awareness. We're here to brief you on the findings and the required next steps." Vance closed his mouth. Laura looked at the table. One of the legal team members, a woman in her early 50s, with the polished, cautious bearing of someone who had been in many rooms like this one, said, "What are the next steps with respect to the hospital's operational status?" "The hospital remains open," Fallon said. "Patient care continues. The compromised personnel have been removed from the clinical setting. We'll need continued access for the investigation team, and we'll need full cooperation on records disclosure. And the personnel who were involved, that's a federal matter. I understand that. I'm asking about the hospital's internal federal matter," Fallon said again, with the same tone. Not dismissive. Just clear about where the boundary was. Laura was looking at the surface of the conference table when Fallon said her name, Chief Petty Officer Voss. She looked up. The legal team member looked confused. Vance looked confused in a different way. Most of the people in the room, who hadn't known her background now, had the specific expression of people revising a category. "The interdiction last night would not have succeeded without her," Fallon said. "He wasn't performing it. He was just stating it. The way you stated operational facts in a briefing. The IV port compromise, she identified it. The hematoma causing Marsh's pressure drop this morning, she identified it and flagged the correct intervention. The network's prepared response protocol, designed to discredit and eliminate the person who noticed the medication anomalies. She was the person it was designed for. And she noticed anyway." The room was quiet. Vance said carefully, "She was terminated yesterday." "Yes." "The termination was based on falsified documentation." "Yes." Which means he looked at his legal team, then back at Fallon. Her reinstatement would need to be her employment status, Fallon said, is between her and this institution. "I'm noting her contribution to this operation, for the record. The hospital chooses to do with that information is your decision." Vance looked at Laura. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. She wasn't going to make this easy for him. Not because she was angry she was, but that wasn't the reason, but because making it easy for him would mean absorbing the next 10 minutes of institutional discomfort that was properly his to sit in, and she had done enough absorbing on behalf of other people's comfort in this building. He looked away first. At 8:15, Nathan Greer was formally arrested in the hospital's main lobby. Not in a back room. Not quietly, through a side exit, managed for minimum disruption. In the main lobby, at 8:15 in the morning, when the building had filled with its daytime population, administrative staff arriving, visitors signing in at reception, the first of the day shift personnel moving through. This was not Laura's decision or Fallon's preference. It was the product of the arrest warrant's timing, the processing sequence, and the fact that Greer had been held in a secured administrative office since the alley and the formal warrant had come through at 8:07. Laura was not in the lobby when it happened. She was on the 4th floor, outside room 412, where Dr. Owens had just completed a review of Marsh's imaging with the surgical team. The hematoma had been identified and a plan established. He was stable. The surgical team was preparing to manage the feeding vessel with a minimally invasive approach, which carried its own risks in a patient already under significant physiological stress. Alternative continued internal bleeding was not an option. She was standing outside his door when Sandra Briggs appeared at the end of the ICU corridor. Briggs looked at her for a moment. Then she walked the length of the corridor and stood in front of her. "I heard about the lobby," Briggs said. "How bad?" "Quiet. They managed it quietly." She paused. "Relatively." Laura nodded. Briggs was looking at her with the expression of someone who has several things to say and is sorting them by priority. "Vance's office called 20 minutes ago. He wants to meet." "I know. They're going to offer reinstatement." "I know. Are you going to take it?" Laura looked at the door of room 412. The monitoring board showed Marsh's vitals pressure holding at 88 systolic, better than 2 hours systolic. The body responding to the surgical plan's preparation. "I'm going to listen to what he says," she said. Briggs nodded, started to turn, then stopped. "For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth enough, and I know that's not nothing, and it's also not what it should be, I knew yesterday. When I told you, I knew the documentation was wrong. I know you did. I should have..." "Sandra." Laura looked at her. "I know. It's okay. It wasn't entirely okay. But it was the kind of not okay that didn't require the other person to keep standing in it. And Briggs had been as honest as the institution she worked inside allowed her to be, and that was a constrained kind of honesty. But it was real." Briggs left. Laura stood in the corridor. Somewhere in the building below her, the morning was running its course, the lobby clearing. After whatever scene the arrest had or hadn't made, the ER receiving its morning intake, the day shift settling into its rhythms. The hospital was continuing, because hospitals continue, because the people in the beds don't stop needing things while the institution around them is being investigated. She was still standing there when Garza appeared at the stairwell door at 8:47, moving at the pace of someone carrying information that needed to arrive quickly. He reached her and stopped. "We have a problem," he said. He was slightly out of breath. Sims's attorney arrived at the federal holding location at 8:20. Standard representation. We expected it. But at 8:39, Sims requested a proffer. He looked at her. "He wants to talk. He says he has information about the network's principal that we don't have." "What kind of information?" "He says he has a name. A real one, not an alias." Garza paused. "He says the principal is not an outside operator. He says the principal is currently inside this hospital." Laura looked at him. "He's not talking about Greer," Garza said. "Greer is already in custody. He means someone else. Someone we haven't identified. Someone who has been here longer than Greer, longer than Sims's own involvement, who recruited Sims before Sims came to Crestholm." He paused. Someone who was here when the hospital was selected. Someone said the selection. The morning light was coming through the stairwell window at the end of the corridor, long and flat and specific. Laura looked at the door of room 412. Then she looked at the nursing station, the monitoring board, at the names of the patients on the ICU floor, at the staff moving through the corridor morning shift, changed over from overnight. The faces she recognized from 2 years of working in this building, the people she'd eaten lunch near without knowing, people who had looked through her or past her or at the floor when she walked by. One of them had been here the whole time. One of them had chosen this hospital. And Sims, sitting in a federal holding room with his attorney and a proffer request, had a name. Garza's radio clicked. Fallon's voice came through it, tight and fast. Garza, get Voss down here. Sims says he'll only give the name to her. Took the stairs. Not because the elevator was slow, it wasn't, but because she needed the 20 seconds that 4 flights of stairs gave her to organize what she was walking into. Sims had been in federal custody for nearly 3 hours. He had an attorney. He had made a calculated decision to request a proffer, which meant he had assessed his position and concluded that what he knew was worth something to the people holding him. And he had attached one condition to the offer. Her. She thought about that condition on the way down. Not flattered by it, not alarmed by it, just turning it over. Sims had seen her in this hospital for 2 years. He had watched her work. He had been part of the structure that had built the case against her, that had prepared the template to eliminate her when she noticed the wrong things. And now, with that structure dismantled around him, he had asked for her specifically. She wasn't sure yet what that meant. She'd figure it out when she was in the room. Federal holding location was not in the hospital. It was a mobile command unit, a large vehicle, parked in the hospital's administrative lot on the east side, one of 3 that had arrived during the night without announcement. She'd seen them from the window. She hadn't been inside one yet. Fallon met her at the vehicle's exterior. His attorney has approved the proffer parameters, he said, walking beside her toward the command unit's entry. He talks, so we listen. No immediate action. On what he says, he gets consideration in the charging discussion. Standard arrangement. Why me? He said he'd explain it himself. That's not an answer. I know. Fallon stopped at the door. Laura, whatever he says in there about the principal, about who's inside the hospital, we verify independently before we act. You understand that? I'm not going to go arrest someone based on what Albert Sims tells me. Good. He opened the door. The interior of the command unit was divided into 2 sections by a partition. The front section held equipment, personnel, communications infrastructure. The rear section was a narrow room with a table, 4 chairs, and the particular quality of close air that came from a sealed space with multiple people in it. Sims was already seated. He looked smaller than he did in the hospital. People sometimes did, removed from their professional context, diminished by the absence of the setting that gave them their definition. He was in his early 50s, thin, with the careful face of someone who had spent decades being precise about small things. He had always struck her as exactly what he appeared to be, a meticulous, controlled professional who ran a clean pharmacy operation and gave no visible sign of anything beyond that. That invisibility, she understood now, had been the point. His attorney sat beside him, a man in a dark suit who looked like he'd been awake as long as everyone else and was managing it less gracefully. Laura sat across from Sims. Fallon stood at the partition. Sims looked at her for a moment. His expression was not apologetic. It was not hostile. It was the expression of someone who has been doing a very precise calculation for a very long time and has arrived at the last variable. You're not what they thought you were, he said. I know. I mean that specifically. When Greer flagged you, when he came to me and said there was a nurse in Tranche 2 who had identified the compound, I looked at your file, the hospital file. He paused. It didn't have anything unusual in it. The system showed a standard clinical hire. BSN, 2 years of floor experience, unremarkable performance reviews. The system wasn't supposed to have anything unusual. No. He looked at the table. I should have looked harder. We should have looked harder before we built the response. A pause, not an apology. I'm just telling you where the error was. Tell me about the principal, she said. He looked up. Something in his face shifted a faint, involuntary expression that was almost admiration. The way people sometimes looked at someone who didn't waste time on the things that didn't matter. Her name is Dr. Vivian Marsh, he said. The name landed in the room with a specific weight. Laura kept her face still. Relation? His sister. Sims watched her absorb this. Daniel Marsh's older sister. She's been on the hospital's medical staff for 9 years. Neurology. She has admitting privileges across 3 departments and the research pressure appointment that gives her access to patient records outside her direct caseload. She chose this hospital. She chose it before he was placed here. She had saw expect that she had already established herself here before the witness protection arrangement was finalized. When the federal program placed him in Crestholm, it was because the protection assessment rated the city as low risk. He paused. The assessment didn't know she was already inside the hospital. Laura thought about the network's architecture, the partitions, the way each participant had known only their piece, Culver, Pruitt, even Greer, operating in their own defined lanes. And at the top of it, not an outside operator with encrypted communications, but a woman with a neurology practice and a research appointment who had been inside this building for 9 years, who had watched her brother be placed in a witness protection program and had positioned herself to make sure his testimony never happened. Why does she want him dead? Laura said. Sims was quiet for a moment. His attorney put a hand on his arm, a cautionary touch, the gesture of someone reminding of the limits of the proffer agreement. Sims said, the network Daniel Marsh was going to testify against. The weapons distribution operation. He looked at the table. Vivian Marsh was not just adjacent to it. She was a financial architect of it 11 years ago. Before the hospital, before Crestholm, before any of this, she built the funding structure. If Daniel testifies, the testimony will include transactions that trace back to her, not as a peripheral figure, as a primary one. She's been trying to kill her own brother, Laura said, to protect herself. She's been trying to eliminate a witness, Sims said. Familial relationship is incidental to her. The room was very quiet. Laura looked at him. She thought about the relay device under the medication cabinet. Template termination file. The Dormer City nurse Margaret Olson, who had lost her license and spent 18 months as a home health aide because she had noticed the same things Laura had noticed and had been processed by the same system. You built the template, she said. The termination structure. The one used here and in Dormer City. Sims didn't deny it. It was an existing framework. I refined it. You refined it. For use against nurses who noticed medication anomalies. Yes. How many times was it used? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said 4 times, including you. 4 times. 4 people who had looked at the right things in the wrong places and had been systematically removed and discredited and silenced, their professional records adjusted to make the silence look earned. The other 3, she said. Do they know? About each other? No. About what happened here tonight? Not yet. She stood. That's everything I need, she said. Sims looked up. Voss. He said her name with the particular quality of someone who has one more thing and isn't sure they should say it. She's good. Vivian Marsh, at appearing to be exactly what she seems. 9 years in this hospital, and nobody looked at her sideways. I know, Laura said. That's also not new information. She walked out. Fallon was on his radio before the command unit door closed behind her. The logistics of arresting a senior physician on a hospital's active medical staff during morning rounds required a specific sequence, not because the arrest itself was complicated, but because the hospital environment required it to be managed in a way that didn't compromise patient care, didn't create a scene that impeded clinical operations, and didn't give the subject an opportunity to access any system or any person before the warrant was executed. Vivian Marsh was currently in the neurology department on the 2nd floor. Laura knew the neurology department's layout. She knew the secondary exit from the attending physician's suite that most people didn't use, that connected through a supply corridor to the main stairwell. He relayed it. Coverage was repositioned within 4 minutes. She didn't go to the 2nd floor herself. That wasn't her role, and she understood that clearly there was a version of this where she inserted herself into the operational sequence, and it served her emotional needs and complicated the legal execution. And she wasn't going to do that. She had spent a long time learning the difference between what she was entitled to want and what she should actually do with that want. She went back to the 4th floor instead. She stood outside room 412 and waited. She heard about the arrest through Garza, who texted her a 3-word message at 9:22. She's in custody. No drama, no scene in the corridor. Coverage at the secondary exit had been necessary, Vivian Marsh had, in fact, moved toward it when the federal personnel entered the attending suite, which suggested either she had been monitoring communications or she had simply understood, on some experienced professional level, that the morning had changed in a way that concerned her. She hadn't made it to the exit. Laura put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the door of room 412. She thought about a woman who had spent 9 years building a life in this hospital while simultaneously building a mechanism to eliminate her own brother. She thought about what that required: the sustained compartmentalization, the continuous management of 2 identities in one body, the specific discipline of appearing exactly ordinary while constructing something that was the opposite of ordinary. She understood, in a technical sense, how it was done. She had been trained by people who did similar things in different contexts for different reasons. She didn't understand it in any other sense. Some people were built for that kind of fracture. She never had been. It was part of why she'd left. At 10:40 that morning, Gerald Vance's office requested a formal meeting with Laura. She went. The meeting was in the hospital's executive conference room. Different from the 3rd-floor room where the morning briefing had taken place, this one with windows overlooking the hospital's main entrance and a table that had been polished recently, enough to still smell faintly of the product used on it. Vance was there with both members of his legal team, and Laura didn't recognize who was introduced as the hospital board's HR director. They offered her a seat. She took it. Vance opened the meeting with the language of institutional contrition that had clearly been drafted by the legal team, acknowledgement of the procedural failures, expression of the hospital's commitment to corrective action, recognition that the termination documentation had not followed proper evidentiary standards. Careful language. It was designed to express regret without constituting admission of direct institutional liability. She let him finish. Then she said, "I want 3 things." Vance looked at his legal team. One of them nodded slightly. "The first is full reinstatement, not provisional, not conditional. Clean reinstatement with the backdated termination removed from my employment record entirely." "That's yes," Vance said. "That's being processed." The second is a formal review of every nurse disciplinary action filed in this department over the last 5 years. I want them reviewed by an external party, not hospital administration, not the internal compliance office. External. I want to know how many of those actions followed a pattern consistent with what was done to me. Vance was quiet for a moment. His legal team exchanged a look. That review, the HR director said carefully, would be a significant undertaking. "I know what it is," Laura said. "That's the second thing." Another pause. Vance said, "We can commit to initiating that review." Committing to initiating and completing are different things. I want a completion timeline in writing. 90 days, the legal team member said. 60. Vance looked at her. She looked back at him. He nodded. "The third thing," she said, "is Margaret Olson." The room was quiet. The name meant nothing to most of the people in it. She's a nurse in Dormer City who lost her license 18 months ago after she identified the same medication anomalies I identified in a hospital where Albert Sims worked before he came here. The mechanism used to terminate and discredit her was a template, the same template used against me. She looked at Vance. This hospital is not responsible for what happened to her. The system that happened to her and the system that happened to me are connected, and the network operating out of this hospital is the link. When the federal investigation is complete, Margaret Olson's case will be part of the evidentiary record. "I'm not sure what you're asking from us," Vance said. "I'm not asking anything from you about her. I'm telling you she exists because I want this room to know that what happened here wasn't singular. It happened before. It happened to someone who didn't have a federal task force showing up at 2 in the morning. She paused. "I'm going to contact her myself. I wanted you to have the context." Vance looked at his hands. He had the expression of a man who has been handed a scope of problem much larger than the one he thought he was managing when he got in his car this morning. Is there anything else? He said. Laura stood. That's everything. She walked out of the executive conference rooms and closed the door behind her. The federal investigation formally expanded its scope at 11:15 that morning. The paperwork originating from the mobile command unit in the administrative lot and transmitting to 3 separate federal jurisdictions simultaneously. The Dormer City connection made the investigation multi-district. The communication log from Sims's router, now substantially decrypted, established the operational history of the network across 4 hospital locations over 7 years. Vivian Marsh was processed at the federal holding facility and transported to a detention center. Her attorney arrived at 1 in the afternoon. The charges were substantial enough that the bail hearing, scheduled for the following week, would be largely theoretical. The flight risk assessment, given the scope of the charges and the international dimensions of the financial network she had helped architect, was essentially categorical. Nathan Greer's charges were filed that afternoon. The documentation included the backdated termination file, the communication logs establishing his coordination with Sims and the network, the evidence from the medication cabinet bypass in Trauma 2, and the testimony of both Culver and Pruitt, identifying him as the person who had recruited and directed them. His medical license was suspended pending the outcome of the proceedings, which his own attorney privately assessed as not pending for very long. Albert Sims's cooperation agreement was formalized at 2 in the afternoon. The information he provided in his proffer, including the identification of Vivian Marsh, was consistent with what the decrypted communications independently established, which strengthened the evidentiary value of both. His cooperation would be considered in sentencing, which his attorney was careful to note was not the same as immunity, and which Sims, to his credit, appeared to understand precisely. Ray Culver and Catherine Pruitt were charged as accessories. Physically, psychologically, professionally, the charges acknowledged their limited knowledge of the network's full scope, and both cooperation agreements were finalized before the end of the business day. The outcomes of their respective legal processes would unfold over months through the machinery of federal prosecution that moved at its own deliberate pace, regardless of how fast the events leading to it had moved. The hospital's board met at 3 in the afternoon, in emergency session. The meeting lasted 2 hours and resulted in the mandatory placement of an external compliance monitor, the suspension of 3 additional administrative personnel, pending the external review Laura had requested, and the formal authorization of the 60-day review of disciplinary actions. Laura was not in any of those rooms while those things happened. She was on the 4th floor. Daniel Marsh came off the ventilator at 2:47 in the afternoon. The surgical team had managed the hematoma successfully, not without complication. Not in the clean, resolved way of something that goes exactly as planned, but successfully, which in surgery meant the patient was alive and stable at the end of it, and the bleeding had stopped. He was breathing on his own by early afternoon. Sedation tapered to a level that allowed the ventilator to be withdrawn, while he remained drowsy and only intermittently aware. Laura was not in his room when it happened. She was in the corridor, and Dr. Owens came out at 2:51 and said, "He's off the vent. Pressure is holding. He's going to make it." Laura said, "Good." Owens looked at her for a moment. She had been on shift since the previous evening and looked appropriately destroyed by it, in the way of people who had done significant work under significant pressure and had not yet had the opportunity to process any of it. He asked who changed his IV line. Owens said, "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was one of the nurses." She paused. He said he wanted to thank her. Laura looked at the door of room 412. "He doesn't need to," she said. "I know. But he wants to." She went in. Marsh was awake in the uncertain, effortful way of someone emerging from significant sedation, aware but not yet fully assembled, the eyes present before the rest of the person catches up. He was bigger lying down than she'd realized from the 2 times she'd stood at his bedside in the dark, broad, through the chest, with hands that looked like they had built things. The bruise on his temple had faded further overnight to a yellow-green that made him look older than the chart he was. 6 and Sue. He looked at her when she came in. "You're the one," he said. His voice was rough from the ventilator, the specific rasp that took a day or 2 to clear. "I work here," she said. The doctor said, "A nurse changed my line." He looked at her steadily. "Middle of the night." "Yes." "Why?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the honest version, which was that she had changed his line, because the alternative was watching him die of something she could prevent, and watching things she could prevent without acting on them was not a mode she was capable of operating in, not at 2 in the morning, not in a brightly lit trauma bay, not in any conditions she had ever encountered. But that was a long answer for a man 20 minutes off a ventilator. "Because it needed to be changed," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes had the particular quality of someone who had spent enough time in difficult situations to recognize people who had also been in them, not what they looked like, but something underneath that. "Thank you," he said. "Get some rest," she said. "You have things to do in 9 days." She walked out. 4:30, she found a quiet room on the 2nd floor, not a room she'd used before, a small staff lounge near the administrative wing that was empty at that hour, and she sat down in a chair that was not particularly comfortable, and she called a number she had looked up that morning through Reyes. It rang 4 times. Hello, the voice was cautious. The voice of someone who had learned to be cautious about unknown numbers. "Is this Margaret Olson?" Laura said. A pause. "Yes. My name is Laura Voss. I'm a nurse at Harwick General Hospital in Crestholm. I need to tell you about something that happened last night, and I need to tell you that you were right. Everything you reported in Dormer City, you were right, and the record is going to show that." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Laura thought the call might have dropped. Then Margaret Olson said, very quietly, "Say that again." And Laura said it again. She sat in the quiet staff lounge and talked for 40 minutes, and she told Margaret Olson what had been found and what had been proven and what the evidentiary record was going to contain. And she told her about the template. And she told her that she was not the only one and had never been the only one. And she listened while Margaret Olson said things that Laura recognized in a structural way, the specific expressions of a person who has been carrying the weight of having been right about something that everyone around them decided to treat as wrongness, and has been carrying it alone, and is now being told by another person who has the receipts that the weight was real. She didn't tell her it was going to be easy from here. It wasn't going to be easy. The legal process of restoring a nursing license was long and uneven and depended on jurisdictional review boards that moved at their own pace, regardless of what federal evidence said about the circumstances of the original revocation. She told her that instead, the honest version, the version that didn't promise more than she could actually see from where she stood, Margaret Olson said, at the end of it, "I've been telling my daughter for 18 months that I wasn't crazy, that I saw what I saw." "You weren't," Laura said. "And you did. Does she know that now? Are there records?" "There will be." "Yes." Another pause. "Okay," Margaret Olson said. Not dramatically. Just, okay. The word of someone filing something important in a place where they can find it again. They exchanged contact information. Laura told her that Reyes would be in touch through official channels within the week. She said goodbye and ended the call and sat in the chair in the quiet lounge for a few minutes without moving. She thought about the question of what it cost. Not abstractly, specifically. Cost of being right in the wrong room. The cost of saying don't give him that to a person who has the authority and has already decided and is going to do it anyway. Cost of being the person who notices in a system that has built functional mechanisms for managing people who notice. Thought about the fact that Margaret Olson had paid that cost with no return for 18 months. She thought about the black coin in her jacket pocket, worn smooth on one side, the emblem on the other still sharp, and she thought about what it represented, which was not the past she'd left, but the part of her that had never actually belonged to any institution. That part, the part that looked at a syringe and knew something was wrong, and said so regardless of the room that had never been the military's, and it had never been Harwick General's, and it had never been anyone's except hers. That was the part they couldn't template their way around. She went back to work at 5 in the afternoon, not because she had been officially reinstated, the paperwork, for that was still in process. The formal documentation winding through the administrative channels, that formal documentation always wound through, regardless of what everyone in the building already knew. She went back to work because Sandra Briggs appeared at the lounge door at 4:55 and said, "We're short-staffed in the ER, and there's a multi-car on the interstate," and looked at her with the specific expression of someone who already knows the answer and is asking as a formality. Laura stood up. She went to her locker. She changed into scrubs. She stood for a moment at the open locker and looked at the black coin sitting at the bottom of it. And then she closed the door. She didn't need to look at it today. The ER was already running at capacity when she arrived. 2 ambulances at the bay, a third coming in. The charge desk was coordinating 3 simultaneous assessments. Particular organized chaos of a major trauma intake was in full motion gurneys moving fast. Monitors, alarming, voices relaying information in the shorthand that took years to learn. She moved into it the way she always moved into it. Economical, aware of everything peripheral, looking for the things that didn't look right before they became emergencies. A young resident, she didn't know his name. He was new, maybe 3 weeks into his rotation, was standing at the medication tray outside Trauma 1 with an expression that was somewhere between focused and overwhelmed. She was holding a syringe and looking at a chart with the particular face of someone who has made a calculation and is not fully confident in it. Stopped beside him. "What are you drawing up?" she said. He told her. She looked at the chart. She looked at the syringe. "Patient's creatinine," she said. "Did you see it in the intake labs?" He looked at the chart again. His face changed. "Reduce the dose," she said. 30%. "With that renal function, the standard dose is going to accumulate." He looked at her. He didn't know who she was. She was just a nurse in scrubs who had stopped beside him at a medication tray. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He looked at the chart one more time. Then he drew up the adjusted dose. "Thank you," he said. She was already moving toward the next room. 2 weeks later, the federal investigation produced its first round of indictments. 17 people across 4 hospital locations, spanning 7 years. The indictments were unsealed on a Tuesday morning and covered by the regional news, and picked up nationally by the end of the afternoon. Coverage mentioned the weapons distribution network, the witness protection failures, the hospital infrastructure. It mentioned Vivian Marsh, Nathan Greer, Albert Sims. It mentioned the Dormer City connection and the multi-district scope. It mentioned, in 3 sentences near the end of the 3rd article, Laura read, the network had been identified in part through the actions of a nurse at Harwick General Hospital who had intervened during a critical patient event and subsequently assisted in the assessment of multiple network participants during a single overnight operation. The article did not use her name. She read those 3 sentences twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to the patient in Trauma 3 who was waiting for a fluid assessment. 6 weeks after that, the external review of Harwick General's disciplinary records was completed ahead of the 60-day timeline. It identified 7 cases over 4 years that showed documentation patterns consistent with the template structure. 3 of those cases involved nurses who had raised medication concerns before their terminations. All 3 were notified. The process of reviewing their cases through the state nursing board was initiated. Margaret Olson's license reinstatement process began in the 4th week of that period, initiated through a joint filing supported by the Federal Investigations Evidentiary Record. Her attorney provided through a victims advocacy program that Reyes had connected her with, said the process would take 3 to 4 months. It took 2.5. On the day Margaret Olson's license was reinstated, she called Laura. "I start back next Monday," she said. "Where? Community health clinic." "Dormer City. It's not the ICU." A pause. "It's still nursing." "That's what matters," Laura said. "Yeah." A pause. "Yeah, it is." Daniel Marsh's testimony was delivered on schedule. The proceedings were closed, the record sealed, the outcome not public in any detail. What was public, 6 months later, was the conclusion of a federal prosecution that resulted in convictions on multiple counts and sentences that were, by the assessment of people who read federal sentencing guidelines closely, significant. The network's financial architecture, including Vivian Marsh's documented role in its construction, was entered into the record in full. Laura read the summary. She noted the relevant lines. She went to work. On a Thursday morning in late winter, 3 months after the night that had started with 4 black SUVs on Benton Street and ended in an alley behind a hospital, Laura arrived at Harwick General at 6:55, 5 minutes early. Same as always. The ER was already running. Briggs was at the charge desk. The overnight shift was handing off. An ambulance was backing into the bay. The fluorescent lights buzzed at their familiar frequency. The monitors ran their continuous measurements. The particular organized chaos of a large emergency department was in full uninterrupted motion. She went to her locker. She opened it. The black coin was at the bottom, where it always was. She looked at it for 3 seconds, the worn, smooth side, the sharp emblem on the other. She thought about what it represented and what it didn't, and she thought about the resident at the medication tray 3 months ago, and the patient in Trauma 2, and Margaret Olson saying, "I start back next Monday," in the particular voice of someone who has been told they were wrong for long enough that being right again requires a specific kind of courage. Closed the locker. She went to work. No ceremony in it. No resolution that felt like a scene. Just a corridor, a charge desk, a board full of patients, and a nurse who moved through the room the way she always had, looking at the things that didn't look right, saying the things that needed to be said, not because anyone was watching or because the outcome was guaranteed, but because that was the job. And she was the person who knew how to do it. She had been dismissed for that. She had been escorted out for that. She had been handed a cardboard box and walked through the emergency entrance and told by the institution that had built its case against her that she would not be coming back. She had come back. Not because the system corrected itself. Systems do not correct themselves. They are corrected by the specific, repeated, costly action of the people inside them who decide that being uncomfortable is preferable to being silent. That saying, "do not give him," that in a room full of people who have decided not to listen is still worth saying, that the right call and the easy call are rarely the same call, and the difference between them is where everything that matters actually lives. There was no medal for it, no tactical uniform, no formal recognition beyond 3 sentences in a news article that didn't use her name. She had not expected any of those things. She had never been doing it for those things. She was halfway down the corridor when Briggs called her name. Voss, Trauma 2, incoming ETA 4 minutes. She turned. On it, she said, and she went.